There's a spiritual practice Joel Goldsmith taught that made religious institutions so uncomfortable. Some denominational leaders actually warned their congregations against it, not because it was dangerous, but because it worked without needing their permission, their buildings, or their approval. This practice gave ordinary people direct access to healing power. What terrified these institutions wasn't the technique itself, it was that people began experiencing genuine transformation without intermediaries, without rituals, without the structures that kept them dependent. Joel called this practice impersonalization, and it dissolved problems that years of traditional prayer couldn't touch. The controversy started in the 1950s when Joel's students began sharing remarkable healing experiences. Physical conditions improved, relationships transformed, financial struggles resolved, all through a practice that required nothing external, just a shift in how you perceive the person or situation before you. Impersonalization means recognizing that what appears as a problem in another person isn't actually them. It's an impersonal belief operating through them, a universal clears-throat suggestion that has no real power or presence. You stop fighting the person and start seeing through the illusion that has temporarily attached itself to their human appearance. When Amanda looked at her aggressive colleague Brian, she stopped seeing him as the problem. She began recognizing that aggression itself was an impersonal force, a belief in separation and fear that could operate through anyone. Brian wasn't inherently aggressive. He was temporarily expressing an impersonal pattern that had no spiritual reality or legitimate existence. This recognition didn't require Amanda to confront Brian, pray for him in traditional ways, or try to change him through mental effort. She simply held the awareness that the spiritual identity of Brian remained untouched by this temporary human expression. The impersonal nature of the problem meant it had no real attachment to him as an individual being. The practice works because consciousness creates experience. When you impersonalize, you stop feeding the false appearance with your belief that it's real and permanent. You withdraw your mental agreement that this person is the problem, recognizing instead that they're experiencing a temporary suggestion that has no power except what human belief gives it through sustained attention. Joel discovered this principle through years of spiritual practice and mystical insight. He found that when you stop personalizing problems, they lose their grip on your experience. The person you were struggling with suddenly changes, not because you tried to change them, but because you changed your perception of what was actually happening in consciousness. Religious authorities resisted this teaching because it bypassed their entire system. You didn't need absolution, rituals, or someone else's prayers. You needed clear spiritual vision that recognized the impersonal nature of all discord, disease, and dysfunction. This vision was available to anyone willing to practice it consistently over time with patience and dedication. Here's how the practice unfolds in daily life. When someone criticizes you harshly, your first impulse is to defend yourself or attack back. But impersonalization asks you to pause and recognize that criticism itself is an impersonal suggestion of inadequacy or judgment, seeking expression through this person. They're not the source, they're the temporary channel for something impersonal. This recognition doesn't make you passive or weak, it makes you spiritually intelligent. You respond to the situation appropriately while maintaining inner awareness that the spiritual identity of this person remains perfect and untouched. The human behavior is temporary. The spiritual reality is permanent and unchanging despite appearances. Within days or weeks of practicing this consistently, you'll notice the relationship shifts. The person becomes less aggressive, less critical, or circumstances naturally separate you, not through manipulation or mental force, but through the natural outworking of consciousness, recognizing truth. The impersonal pattern simply loses its power to operate through that individual in your presence and experience. Daniel was a hospital administrator dealing with a board member named Nicole who opposed every initiative he proposed. For 6 months, meetings became battlegrounds. Daniel tried diplomacy, tried avoiding her, tried building alliances against her. Nothing worked. Nicole seemed personally committed to blocking his vision for patient care improvements. Then Daniel encountered Joel Goldsmith's impersonalization practice through a friend's recommendation. The concept seemed too simple to work against such persistent opposition. But Daniel was desperate enough to try anything. He began practicing during his morning meditation, recognizing that Nicole's opposition wasn't personal, but an impersonal belief in limitation and control-seeking expression. For 3 weeks, Daniel practiced this recognition daily. He didn't change his proposals or his approach to board meetings. He simply maintained the inner awareness that Nicole's spiritual identity remained perfect, untouched by the impersonal pattern of resistance operating through her human behavior. He stopped seeing her as the enemy and started seeing through the impersonal nature of opposition itself. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during a routine budget meeting. Nicole suddenly supported one of Daniel's proposals, offering constructive modifications rather than automatic rejection. Other board members looked surprised. Daniel maintained his inner practice, recognizing this shift as the natural result of consciousness responding to truth rather than personal manipulation. Over the following 2 months, Nicole became one of Daniel's strongest allies. She never acknowledged the shift, never apologized for past opposition. The change happened organically as the impersonal pattern lost its power to operate through her. In Daniel's experience, the hospital implemented patient care improvements that benefited thousands. Joel taught that this is how impersonalization works in the real world, not through dramatic confrontations or overnight miracles, but through gradual shifts in consciousness that naturally produce changes in experience. The timeline varies. Some situations shift quickly. Others require weeks or months of consistent practice before visible results emerge in your daily life. Kevin struggled with chronic lower back pain that doctors couldn't fully explain. Physical therapy helped temporarily, but the pain always returned. His physician suggested the problem might have stress components, but traditional stress management techniques provided minimal relief. Kevin was considering surgery despite the uncertain prognosis and significant recovery time. A friend introduced Kevin to Joel Goldsmith's teachings on impersonalizing disease. The concept challenged everything Kevin believed about physical healing. How could recognizing pain as impersonal change a physical condition? Yet pharmaceutical options were exhausted, and Kevin was willing to explore alternatives before committing to surgery with questionable outcomes. Kevin began practicing daily instead of fighting the pain or identifying himself as a chronic pain sufferer. He recognized that pain itself was an impersonal suggestion of separation from wholeness. The pain wasn't him, wasn't his identity, wasn't his permanent reality. It was a temporary, impersonal pattern passing through his experience. After 6 weeks of consistent practice, Kevin noticed the pain intensity decreasing, not dramatically, not overnight, but gradually and steadily. By 3 months, he functioned normally most days. His physician was surprised, but attributed it to delayed response from previous physical therapy. Kevin knew differently. He had changed his consciousness about pain itself. The practice didn't replace medical care. Kevin continued appropriate physical activity and professional consultation, clears throat, but impersonalization added a spiritual dimension that addressed the consciousness component of physical experience. Kevin learned that many conditions have both physical and consciousness elements, and addressing consciousness can support overall healing in ways purely physical treatments sometimes cannot. If these transformation stories inspire you, like this video to help others discover Joel Goldsmith's forbidden practice. Subscribe for more mystical Christianity wisdom that denominations tried to suppress, and comment which story resonated most with your current situation. Beyond impersonalization, Joel taught a complementary practice called recognition. While impersonalization removes false beliefs about others, recognition establishes spiritual truth about their real identity. Together, these practices create a complete approach to consciousness transformation that addresses both the removal of error and the establishment of truth simultaneously. Recognition means consciously acknowledging the spiritual perfection already present. When you look at someone struggling with addiction, disease, or dysfunction, recognition sees past the human appearance to the divine consciousness that constitutes their actual being. This isn't positive thinking or denial. It's spiritual vision that perceives what's eternally true despite temporary appearances. Jonathan practiced recognition with his sister Ashley, who struggled with severe anxiety. Instead of focusing on her symptoms or trying to fix her mentally, Jonathan held recognition of her spiritual completeness. He didn't announce this practice to her or make it obvious. He simply maintained the inner awareness during their conversations and family interactions. The recognition practice doesn't require the other person's cooperation or awareness. You're not sending them thoughts or trying to influence them mentally. You're simply aligning your consciousness with spiritual truth about their identity. This alignment naturally affects the field of consciousness you share, creating space for their healing without any manipulation or mental force directed at them. Ashley began improving over several months. Her anxiety attacks decreased in frequency and intensity. She attributed the improvement to therapy and medication adjustments, and Jonathan never corrected her. The important thing wasn't who received credit, but that Ashley's quality of life improved. As Jonathan maintained recognition of her spiritual perfection consistently, Joel emphasized that recognition works alongside traditional care, not as a replacement. Ashley's therapy provided practical tools. Her medication supported brain chemistry, and Jonathan's recognition addressed the consciousness dimension. All three contributed to her overall healing process. Spiritual practice complements professional care rather than competing with it in most situations. Another complementary technique Joel taught was meditation on spiritual identity. This differs from traditional meditation that seeks peace or clarity. This meditation establishes conscious awareness of your own divine nature, which then radiates into your experience naturally. You're not trying to change your circumstances, you're recognizing the consciousness that creates circumstances. Michelle spent 20 minutes each morning in this meditation. She didn't ask for anything, didn't visualize outcomes, didn't repeat affirmations. She simply rested in awareness of consciousness itself as her true identity, the infinite, eternal, perfect consciousness that Joel called the Christ within the presence of God as individual being and awareness. This practice seemed passive, but Michelle discovered its power through consistent application over months. Her business challenges resolved not through her EFing, but through opportunities and connections that emerged naturally. Her health improved without dramatic interventions. Her relationships deepened as she stopped trying to control them and simply maintained awareness of spiritual perfection. The meditation practice supports both impersonalization and recognition by establishing your own consciousness and truth. When you're anchored in awareness of your spiritual identity, impersonalizing others becomes natural. You automatically see through false appearances because you're not caught in them yourself. Recognition flows easily because you're conscious of the divine nature you're recognizing in everyone. Richard combined all three practices into his daily spiritual routine. Morning meditation established his consciousness in truth. Rough out the day, he impersonalized challenges and recognized spiritual perfection in others. This comprehensive approach created a consciousness that naturally manifested harmony, health, and wholeness. Not instantly, not magically, but progressively over weeks and months of consistent practice. Joel taught that spiritual development is gradual. You don't master these practices overnight. Some days are easier than others. Some situations respond quickly. Others require persistent practice over extended periods. The key is consistency, returning to the practice daily regardless of immediate visible results. Consciousness transformation precedes experience transformation, sometimes by weeks or months before you see the evidence. The most common challenge with impersonalization is the temptation to make it a mental technique to manipulate others. You practice impersonalization, hoping the difficult person will change or leave your life. This motivation corrupts the practice because you're still personalizing the problem, just using a spiritual technique to try to control it mentally. Brandon struggled with this for months. He practiced impersonalization toward his manager, Anthony, hoping Anthony would quit or transfer. When nothing changed after several weeks, Brandon felt the practice failed. He didn't realize his motivation was still rooted in personal manipulation rather than genuine spiritual recognition of truth, regardless of outcomes. A Joel Goldsmith teacher helped Brandon understand the subtle difference. Impersonalization isn't about getting what you want through spiritual techniques. It's about seeing truth clearly and letting that truth naturally govern your experience. The outcome might be Anthony changing, or you changing, or the situation resolving through unexpected means. You release attachment to specific results. Another obstacle is inconsistency. Yo, you practice impersonalization when you're angry or frustrated, but forget it when things calm down. This sporadic approach produces sporadic results. The impersonal pattern returns because you haven't established consistent consciousness that sees through it permanently. Joel emphasized that consciousness work requires the same consistency as physical exercise for lasting benefits. Samantha discovered this through her practice with a neighbor named Ryan who played loud music late at night. She would impersonalize during conflicts, feel better temporarily, but then slip back into personalizing Ryan as the problem when the music started again. The pattern continued because her practice was reactive rather than proactive and consistent. When Samantha began practicing impersonalization daily, regardless of whether Ryan played music that night, the situation transformed. Her consciousness shifted from reactive anger to stable spiritual recognition. Ryan either began using headphones or Samantha stopped being disturbed by the music. The exact mechanism didn't matter because her experience changed through changed consciousness maintained consistently. A third challenge is expecting instant results. You practice for a few days or weeks, and when the situation doesn't immediately change, you conclude the practice doesn't work. But consciousness transformation operates on its own timeline. Some patterns dissolve quickly, others are deeply entrenched and require months of consistent practice before visible shifts emerge. Angela practiced impersonalization toward her adult daughter Catherine, who struggled with addiction. After 2 months with no visible improvement, Angela felt discouraged. A spiritual counselor reminded her that addiction involves complex physical, emotional, and consciousness components. Spiritual practice supports healing but doesn't replace professional training. Admit or guarantee specific timelines. Angela continued practicing for 8 more months. Gradually, Catherine began making different choices. She entered treatment, completed the program, and began rebuilding her life. The timeline was longer than Angela hoped, but the outcome was genuine. Joel taught that spiritual practice works with divine timing, not human impatience. Your role is consistent practice, not controlling outcomes or timelines. Perhaps the deepest challenge is practicing impersonalization when you're the one being impersonalized negatively by others. Someone judges you, criticizes you, or treats you unfairly. Can you recognize that their judgment is an impersonal pattern, not the truth about you? Can you maintain awareness of your spiritual identity while they're attacking your human personality? Timothy faced this when colleagues spread false rumors about his professional competence. His reputation suffered. His career advancement stalled. The temptation was to defend himself aggressively or retreat in shame. Instead, Timothy practiced impersonalizing both the colleagues and the rumors themselves, recognizing that false judgment was an impersonal pattern without legitimate power or reality. The practice required months of inner discipline. Timothy addressed the situation appropriately at work, while maintaining spiritual recognition that his true identity remained untouched. Eventually, the truth emerged naturally, his reputation restored. But the real victory was Timothy's consciousness remaining stable throughout the crisis through consistent spiritual practice, regardless of external circumstances. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak to your heart, like to support this wisdom being shared freely, subscribe for advanced Joel Goldsmith practices. Denominations didn't want you to know and comment which obstacle you're ready to transform. Impersonalization. Now, advanced practitioners learn to impersonalize their own negative patterns. When you catch yourself being judgmental, fearful, or resentful, you can recognize these as impersonal patterns operating through you temporarily. You're not a judgmental person. You're experiencing an impersonal suggestion of judgment. This recognition allows the pattern to dissolve without guilt or self-condemnation weighing you down. William discovered this application after years of practicing impersonalization toward others. He realized he could apply the same principle to his own anger issues. Instead of identifying as an angry person who needed fixing, William recognized anger itself as an impersonal force-seeking expression. This shift allowed him to observe anger arising without claiming it as his identity. Over 6 months, William's anger responses diminished dramatically, not through suppression or psychological techniques, but through consistent, spiritual recognition that anger was impersonal, temporary, and not his true nature. When anger arose, William impersonalized it the same way he had learned to impersonalize others' negative behaviors toward him. Joel taught that you can impersonalize social and political conflicts. When you read news of violence, corruption, or injustice, you can recognize these as impersonal patterns of belief in separation, fear, and lack operating through collective human consciousness. This doesn't make you passive or uncaring. It makes you spiritually intelligent about the true nature of collective challenges. Emily practiced this during intense political divisions in her community. Instead of demonizing those with opposing views, she recognized that divisiveness itself was an impersonal pattern seeking expression through everyone regardless of political affiliation. This recognition didn't change her own convictions, BU. It freed her from the hatred and fear that poisoned others' experience of community life. Emily participated in community dialogue events, bringing a consciousness of spiritual unity beneath surface disagreements. She didn't convert anyone to her political views, but her presence created space for respectful exchange. Several participants later mentioned that conversations with Emily felt different, more human, less combative. Her impersonalization practice created an atmosphere where others could connect beyond their differences. Advanced impersonalization extends to global challenges. Poverty, disease, war, and environmental destruction appear as massive problems beyond individual influence. But Joel taught that all discord is impersonal, operating at whatever scale human consciousness allows through collective belief and agreement. Your individual practice of recognizing the impersonal nature of these challenges contributes to collective consciousness shift. Nathan worked in international development, confronting poverty and corruption daily. The enormity of suffering overwhelmed him until he began practicing impersonalization. He recognized that poverty consciousness was an impersonal belief in lack and limitation, not the spiritual truth about any community or nation. Corruption was impersonal greed and fear, not the essential nature of any individual leader. This recognition didn't make Nathan naive about systemic challenges or reduce his practical efforts. It gave him spiritual stability to continue the work without despair. His projects became more effective because he approached communities, recognizing their spiritual capacity rather than focusing solely on their human limitations. Results improved over several years as Nathan's consciousness influenced the entire organization's approach. The practice ultimately reveals that there's no separation between spiritual and practical life. Impersonalization isn't something you do during meditation and then forget in daily activities. It becomes your natural way of perceiving reality. You automatically see through surface appearances to the spiritual truth underlying all experience. This vision transforms everything without constant effort. Vanessa reached this stage after 3 years of consistent practice. She no longer had to remind herself to impersonalize or recognize. When challenges arose, her consciousness naturally perceived their impersonal nature and spiritual reality simultaneously. Problems still occurred, but they no longer had the same power to disturb her inner stability or overwhelm her peace. Joel called this state of consciousness spiritual maturity. You're not trying to be spiritual or practice techniques. You're living from spiritual consciousness as your natural state. The human experience continues with its challenges and joys, but you're anchored in awareness that transcends and includes the human level. This is the goal of all spiritual practice, not escape from life, but transformation of consciousness that naturally transforms experience. The forbidden nature of Joel's teaching wasn't about the practice itself, but about the implications. If anyone can access healing power directly through consciousness, what need do they have for institutional intermediaries? If spiritual truth is available through individual recognition, what authority do denominations hold over people's spiritual lives and development? Laura attended a church for years before discovering Joel's teachings. When she shared her experiences with impersonalization and the healing that followed, church leaders warned her against pursuing these practices. They claimed she was falling into dangerous spiritual territory. But Laura recognized their fear wasn't about her safety, it was about losing control over her spiritual authority. Joel faced similar resistance throughout his teaching career. He was asked to leave certain spiritual organizations because his message of individual direct access to divine consciousness threatened hierarchical structures. But Joel persisted because he knew the truth he taught was too valuable to suppress. Thousands experienced genuine transformation through practices that required nothing but willingness and consistency. Today, Joel Goldsmith's teachings continue spreading despite institutional resistance. People discover these practices through books, recordings, online resources, and direct spiritual experience. The forbidden becomes accessible to anyone seeking truth beyond traditional religious frameworks. You don't need permission, credentials, or approval to practice impersonalization and recognition. You need only commitment to consistent application. Matthew discovered Joel's work during a personal crisis when traditional religious approaches failed him. The impersonalization practice seemed radical, even heretical, but Matthew was desperate enough to try it consistently for several months. His crisis resolved not through miracle intervention, but through gradual consciousness transformation that naturally changed his experience. Now Matthew shares these teachings with others facing similar struggles. Some are receptive, others resist. Matthew doesn't force the information or argue with skeptics. He simply shares what worked in his own experience and lets others decide for themselves. This is Joel's approach. Offer truth, demonstrate through living example, and allow individual choice without manipulation or pressure. The practice requires no special circumstances or abilities. You don't need to be spiritually advanced, highly educated, or free from problems to begin. You start exactly where you are with whatever challenges you're facing. Each challenge becomes an opportunity to practice impersonalization and recognition. Each difficulty becomes a classroom for consciousness transformation through consistent application. Christina started practicing while dealing with chronic illness, financial stress, and family conflict simultaneously. She didn't wait until life improved to begin spiritual practice. She practiced in the midst of challenges, sometimes barely maintaining awareness for a few minutes at a time. But those minutes accumulated into hours, days, weeks of shifted consciousness over time. 2 years later, Christina's circumstances had transformed significantly. Her health stabilized, finances improved, family relationships healed. But the real transformation was Christina's consciousness. She had developed spiritual stability that could weather any storm because she no longer identified with circumstances. She recognized herself as the consciousness that creates and experiences circumstances from spiritual awareness. Joel Goldsmith's forbidden practice remains available to you right now. You don't need to join anything, believe anything specific, or change your current spiritual path. You simply need to begin practicing impersonalization and recognition consistently in your daily life. Start with one challenging person or situation. Practice seeing through the impersonal nature of the problem. Practice recognizing spiritual perfection beneath human appearances. Some days will feel powerful, others will feel like nothing's happening. Continue anyway. Some situations will shift quickly, others will require months of practice. Continue anyway. Your consciousness is transforming even when you don't see immediate evidence. Trust the process, trust the practice, trust that consciousness creates experience, and changed consciousness naturally produces changed experience. The denominations tried to stop this teaching because they recognized its power to liberate individuals from dependence on external spiritual authority. But truth cannot be stopped. It spreads from consciousness to consciousness, from practice to practice, from transformation to transformation. You are part of that spreading truth right now, reading these words, considering these practices, preparing to transform your own consciousness and experience through Joel's forbidden wisdom. If your spiritual understanding expanded through Joel Goldsmith's forbidden practices, like this video to help others break free from institutional limitations. Subscribe for more suppressed mystical Christianity teachings and comment. I practice impersonalization to confirm your commitment to consciousness transformation.